no power greater than X.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 44th episode of The Roundabout, celebrating 15 years of the Xbox 360. My name is Ryan Turford, and this is the show where we're counting down the months to the 15-year anniversary of the Xbox 360 with 50 of the best games to play on the console for both new and experienced owners. We dive into the brief history of each game and talk about what makes them awesome. As always, we'd love your feedback on this show over on Twitter at the Xbox Drive, or you can reach out to me directly anytime at Ryan Turford, or if you're watching the video version, you can leave comments in this video's description as well. On this week's episode, we grab our cowboy hats, saddle up, and ride into the wild, wild west in Red Dead Redemption, released on May 18th, 2010. While it was more of a spiritual successor to 2004's Red Dead Revolver than a sequel, Red Dead Redemption was a game I remember people being pretty excited about, but I also remember being a lot of talk at the time that was centered around whether or not the game would sell based on a Wild West setting, and whether or not that would actually sell in 2010, with Rockstar actually stating at the time that they were actually anticipating taking a loss on the game. I mean, I know that the Wild West setting hasn't always been super popular in mainstream culture. I think it's definitely risen a lot since around the time that this game came out, but like the early 2000s, you didn't really see a whole lot of Wild West stuff, and if you did, it mostly flopped. So, I mean, it made sense that there was a lot of speculation around this game in particular, especially also because the original Red Dead Revolver didn't really sell super well either on the original Xbox. So it was just one of those things where people were really skeptical that this game would sell, despite the fact that no one, I think, was questioning the quality of the game. I think people were actually really excited for this game, knowing what we know about Grand Theft Auto and how much people love those games. Even I was a bit cautious about picking up Red Dead, as I've never really been a fan of Western settings at all in any medium. And while I wouldn't say I dislike games from Rockstar either, I have definitely never really been able to get into them. It's one of those things where I pick up almost every single Rockstar game at some point, whether it's all the GTA games or Max Payne or Red Dead. It's just most of the game design in Rockstar games just don't really jive with me. I like kind of the open world aspect and be able to just do whatever you want, but that only is so appealing. And I think there are so many games now that do that so much better than Rockstar, or at least to me anyways. That's just how I feel about it. I think Grand Theft Auto 5 as well is another game from Rockstar that I also pretty got into as well. And I think they learned a lot of lessons after doing Red Dead that they were able to put towards Grand Theft Auto 5. So I do think I'm coming around a little bit on modern Rockstar games, but for the most part, I mean, Grand Theft Auto 3, for example, yes, it was fun to run around and blow stuff up with a rocket launcher, but do I really want to go through a lot of those missions? No, probably not. And that's kind of the way I felt about Grand Theft Auto 4. And I know a lot of people are kind of thinking, well, where's Grand Theft Auto 4 on this list? And the answer is it didn't make my personal top 50 list for that reason. It's just the mission structure in Grand Theft Auto. Number one, I don't think it actually holds up super well, especially when you compare it to modern games, game design. But also, I just didn't really like that game very much. I didn't really get into it at all. The story was really good, and I wanted to keep playing it for the story. But man, just some of those missions are real rough, and it's tough to play that game, I think, especially today. Like, especially when you take modern game design and then you try and compare it against something like Grand Theft Auto 4, it doesn't work. Whereas Red Dead, again, it came out in 2010, so it is much more modern than a lot of those other games. However, with the overflowing positive critical reception, the game sold a ton of copies throughout its life cycle, and it got someone like me who on paper would normally not be the target audience for this game totally on board with this. I love Red Dead Redemption, and it continues to be my personal favorite Rockstar game to this day. In case you haven't played it, in Red Dead Redemption, you play as John Marston, a former outlaw who's being forced by the government to track down members of his old gang while they hold his family in confinement. Upon a failed first attempt to persuade the gang to surrender before the government takes action, John recruits allies and formulates a plan to take down the gang to save his family. While the story sets off to a bit of a slow start, once you get out of the starting area, the story ratchets up really quick. Other than a dip during the game's second act, which anyone who's played the game before can tell you pretty much where it kind of falls apart a bit, I think that the game is actually very well paced with a ton of content for you to see and do in its open world. The game also paints a picture of the Wild West that we usually don't get to see, one that signifies the transition into modernizing the Old West. This plays a large part into the game's themes and the motivation of certain characters in their support for or against this change that's happening, which is something that I was really intrigued by while playing it. Again, it's not something we really see too often in Wild West movies and stuff like that. Like traditional spaghetti westerns, for example, are a specific style, and they usually focus around like the mid to late 1800s, whereas this game takes place in 1911, like well past those traditional Wild West days. And that's kind of what I liked about this game. It just felt unique and different from traditional Wild West games. Of course, one of my favorite parts of Red Dead's story is its ending, which I won't spoil for any new players listening to this podcast, as I think it's still one of the most memorable endings of any game during the 7th generation of video games. For as much as I personally don't jive with Rockstar's games, they've always been masters of crafting compelling narratives, and Red Dead Redemption is no exception. It's a truly epic journey from start to finish, and I loved every single minute of it. The story in Red Dead's so good, and it's probably one of my favorite stories from this generation of consoles. I really loved playing through it. I even liked some of the side stuff as well. I mean, some of the side missions are a little bit hit and miss as far as the story is concerned, but for the most part, the overall narrative is actually really solid. And I loved getting to learn more about John Marston, but even learning about Dutch's gang, for example. I think all those characters are really interesting as well. And Rockstar just crafted a really excellent narrative with Red Dead, and it really shows. It's one of the main reasons why I really have to have this game on this list in particular. As much as I loved the story, the thing that equally hooked me was the game's gameplay. I loved exploring the Old West and trying to find all of its many secrets, which there are a ton to explore. The game comes with a giant map of the environment, but for the most part, if you just run off in a certain direction, you'll usually end up finding something cool along the way, and that's one of the things I've always kind of liked about Rockstar's games, and this game's no exception to that. The gunplay also felt smooth, and combat felt overall much more finely tuned than it was in something like Grand Theft Auto 4 or other Rockstar games, where I think that the shooting controls or the driving controls never really sat right with me in any of their previous games. Whereas in this game, the gunplay feels really solid. It really feels good to ride the horse around the environment as well. Like, it doesn't feel clunky or anything like that. And especially the cover system too. I think just all that stuff just feels so much more natural in this game than some of Rockstar's other games. Plus, the game lets you live out your fantasies of being a gunslinger with the Deadeye mechanic, allowing you to slow down time and place all your shots to take out your opponents or do cool things like shooting their guns out of their hands, especially if you've got multiple enemies. The first thing I usually do is use Dead Aim to kind of Deadeye to basically disarm all of them, and then I'll just mow them down with my gun just when the game resumes normal play. Or you can be like all the silly people and basically put all of your dots on the person's head and just shoot them in the head like 6 times. I mean, I know a lot of people just struggled to get a grasp of what the system was trying to teach you, and that was one of the most common criticisms I heard, was just people just doing that all the time, which you can definitely do. It's just a waste of bullets, but you can definitely do that in this game. This was also prominently used in duels, and it made them feel ripped straight out of A Fistful of Dollars or other spaghetti western movies. You did have the odd escort mission or time-based mission here and there, but they felt a lot less frustrating than the ones found in GTA games, and I found that the mission structure itself was much more modernized with this release, and I think really, when you think about the evolution of Rockstar's games going up to Grand Theft Auto 5, I definitely think that we saw a lot of little hints as to how the mission structure was changing from game to game with this game, where I think there was a big overhaul in the way the missions were designed. Whereas I think with San Andreas to Grand Theft Auto 4, just the mission structure felt very similar. It felt very PS2-y, whereas this one really felt like a 2010 game, like a game that belonged in this era of gaming. And I think that the mission structure is much better put together. Like the levels in particular just feel so much more satisfying. You're not doing stuff like controlling the remote control helicopter, like in Vice City, for example, which is like super frustrating. I mean, there are a lot of really frustrating missions I find in older Rockstar titles. And I found it was just so much more smoother this time around in Red Dead. And I think that's what I really liked about it as well. On top of the lengthy single player, Rockstar also put out one of the best DLC packs of the generation, Undead Nightmare, which has John battling hordes of the undead to help find a cure for the zombie outbreak that has claimed his family. It's a short but sweet piece of DLC that is well worth the price of admission and can be purchased separately from the main game if you want to play this game separately, but obviously my recommendation is play both. I think both are well worth playing, and the DLC, super awesome. For a big fan of horror movies like myself, it was such a breath of fresh air for the franchise, and I loved it. I think that Undead Nightmare is an amazing DLC journey, and again, like one of the best DLC packs of this generation. It is highly recommended from me personally that you check that out, and it's pretty cheap as well to pick up as well. In fact, you can probably pick up both the game and the DLC pack for less than $20 now if you wanted to go grab them now, which is pretty sweet. So how well does Red Dead Redemption hold up today? Both visually and gameplay wise, the game holds up great. There are some nice enhancements for the game on Xbox One X as well, so ultimately that's probably the place I would recommend playing the game going forward, but it still plays great on 360 as well if that's all you got, or if you don't have an Xbox One X specifically, like if you have an S or the original Xbox One, it's going to look about the same as your original 360 version. If you're looking to pick up Red Dead Redemption today, it's available digitally on Xbox 360 and it's backwards compatible on Xbox One. That's all for this episode of The Roundabout. You can hit me up on Twitter anytime at Ryan Turford. You also find the Pantsman himself on Twitter at Sean Capri, or us on Twitter at The Xbox Jive. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Roundabout, and we out. Bye.